Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming out in such lovely numbers on this first night of the cruise. As you've heard, my name's Stefan White. I live in a little Thameside village in Hurley in England, about 40 minutes to the west of London. And it's my pleasure to share with you my thoughts and my knowledge of the ports we're going to. And what an interesting selection. Everything from major bustling cities to smaller little fishing ports and tourist ports. Now, on a cruise ship, there are three types of speaker. There's a port lecturer who will give you the minute detail of what time the museums open and how much it costs to get in and all the minutiae of the ports. There's a destination speaker, and that's one who will give you a rather broader aspect of the culture and the history of the port and the area we're coming to. And then there's an enrichment speaker, and they are specialists and they can speak on any subject. It might be art, it might be antiques, it might be history. Now, the good news is that I'm qualified in all three of these areas. The bad news is that as a result of this, all my talks last 4.5 hours. No, I'm only kidding. 50 minutes. But tonight, because it's a special night, the first night, you're getting a special offer. You're going to get 2 ports for the price of 1. Not only am I going to tell you about Propriano, but it's also my pleasure to tell you about San Remo. So there's a lot of facts and figures. I hope that I'll be able to tell you what you want to know. But what I always do is I stay behind after my talk. And when I know the itinerary of a cruise, I email the tourist office of the port, and I ask for their brochures and their town map. And I get these through the mail, and unfortunately I've only got one of each, so I can't hand them out, but it does give me the ability, if your special interest, for instance, is archaeology, and I've mentioned there's a museum of archaeology in the town we're coming to, then I'll be able to look at these brochures and tell you the minute detail of how much it costs and where to go and what the opening times are. And of course, anytime you see me around the ship, please feel very free to ask me questions about anything that I haven't covered. So, it's my pleasure to tell you about these ports we're coming to. Now, I know that most of you are probably experienced travelers, so please excuse me, because there may be some people who've never been on a cruise before. So very briefly, your options when we come to a port are you can stay on the ship and just enjoy the fabulous facilities that this lovely ship has to offer. You can go into the port, and if we're not tendering in, if we're not moored near the centre of the in the port itself, then there'll usually be a shuttle and you can go into the port and do it yourself. You can take one of the tours, or you could try and do a longer excursion yourself. Now, it's not my job to sell the tours, but I do thoroughly recommend that you, if you're going outside of the port, you take the tours, because you're in safety, you've got a local guide who's got very detailed knowledge, you're in comfort, and you are under the care of Seabourn. If you try and do it yourself and hire a car to go to some remote location, or maybe even take a taxi, or maybe take a bus, things can happen. God forbid, there might be an accident, there might be a flat tire. This ship has got a schedule to keep. And if the departure time is 5 o'clock, and you're stuck at the other end of the island, it may have to leave without you. And then you've got probably no passport, you've probably got a limited amount of money, and you've got to get yourself to the next port. It's not worth the hassle. So please, by all means, I'll tell you a little bit about the ports we're coming to, and I'll be able to tell you what the interesting places are in the port. But if you're going further afield, please take one of the tours. So let's have a look at our first destination. It's on the island of Corsica. And here is Monaco. This is Monte Carlo, where we just left. We're now cruising across here to the island of Corsica. And it's a French island in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, as you can see, located to the west of Italy, north of the Italian island of Sardinia. This is Italian, this is French. It's one of 27 régions of France, and it's a territorial collectivity. All that means that it has a little bit more power than a lot of the other regions of France. Now, Propriano is a pleasant little town. I do like to tell it as it is. This is not a town with great classic museums, huge archaeological treasures. No. It's an interesting, pleasant place to walk around. It's a nice place to visit, but don't expect to have classic antiquities here because they're just not around. It's on the coast of the southwest of Corsica. It's at the head of a very large gulf called Valinco, and it's northwest of another big town called Sartène. Much of the building in Propriano here dates from the early 19th century when the port was really established. Most of the town was built then, although it's obviously been previously occupied by Romans and Greeks earlier, but very little remains of their occupation here. It was frequently attacked by pirates, and unfortunately, during the 18th century, a lot of the older buildings were destroyed by them. In the harbour here, you'll see some exclusive yachts, but you'll also see more modest fishing boats, and it's a pleasure port also. There's a marina there, and there's a small commercial port. It's quite a ferry port. You'll see the big ferries that come over from the south of France. Town centre, pleasant enough to explore. Traditional houses often now taken over by shops, cafes and bars. I first came here in 1979 when our young children used to come with us on summer holidays, and we had been to northern Corsica, loved the island, and we came and then found Propriano the next year, loved it. So we came here for 4 years in a row, and we liked it very much. And we first of all stayed in rented villas outside the town, but then we came into a family club right in the outskirts of the town, right by, not far away from the port, and I'll be interested to see if it's still there. Corsica is split into two. There's Haute Corse, which is the northern part, and there is the Corse du Sud. The regional capital here is Ajaccio, that's the capital of the island, and Propriano is just down here, and we'll be talking about where the tours are going. Bonifacio is right down the tip here, and Sartène is just inland there, so we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Only about 3,250 people in Propriano, fairly small. Corsica is one of the few regions of France that does retain its own language in everyday use. Corsica is much more related to Italian because it was populated by Italians for much of its history. But France took it over in the 18th century, and since then, France has dominated the media and the commerce, and it's estimated today only about 10% of the people still speak Corsican natively. 50% do still have a little bit of proficiency in the language, though. It's been occupied continuously since the Mesolithic era, and that was about 6,000 BC. It's acquired an indigenous population, influential in the Mediterranean area during its prehistory. Briefly, it was occupied by the Carthaginians, colonized later by the ancient Greeks, slightly longer by the Etruscans. I'll be talking about them later as we go through the other ports of call. Republic at the end of the First Punic War, and it became, with Sardinia, a part of the Roman Empire. In the 6th century, the Roman Empire collapsed, and the island was invaded by Vandals, Ostrogoths, Byzantines, Lombards, Saracens, and Pepin the Short. Yeah, king of the Franks, Pepin the Short. He took it over. Charlemagne's father expelled the invaders, and he granted Corsica to Pope Stephen II. The Genoese took possession of the island in 1347, governed it right up until 1729, interrupted only by a little brief occupation by the Ottoman alliance. In 1553, Corsica was invaded, but they soon chucked them out. These Barbary pirates I've told you about, they were really fierce, nasty people. They were operated out of the northern African ports of Tripoli and Algiers, and they were really nasty people. They caused havoc with trade in the Mediterranean for many, many centuries, and they would just rape and pillage their way and steal anything they could, and they frequently attacked towns, took the population away to sell them as slaves, and they were a real problem. I'll be telling you more about those later on, but the towers that you can see occasionally around Corsica, these Genoese watchtowers, which were guarding the entrance to harbours and on the lookout for these very, very nasty pirates. Flag of Corsica, adopted in 1755, and it was based on a traditional flag used previously. It portrays a Moor's head, that's basically the Arabs that came up from the North African, and conquered most of Spain, certainly, and much of Europe. And the bandana covered the eyes, as you can see on the left there. But the Corsicans wanted the bandana removed when it became independent to symbolize the liberation of the Corsican people. So today's flag has the bandana up above the eyes. 1759, Corsican Revolution for Independence began. 26 years of struggle against the Republic of Genoa, but it was formed as an independent republic in 1755. First constitution was written in Italian because that was the language of culture in Corsica until right up to the end of the 19th century. And French losses in the 7 Years' War caused Corsica to be purchased by France from the Republic of Genoa in 1764. Basically, Genoa was bankrupt, so France gave them cash in return for Corsica, and that was when it was incorporated into France in 1770. This is a man who is very important to the history of Corsica, Paoli, Filippo Antonio Pasquale di Paoli, and it's a mouthful, isn't it? He died in 1807. He was a Corsican patriot, leader, president of the Executive Council. He really formed the constitution of Corsica. He was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he really oversaw the Corsican resistance against the French during their brief battle for independence. But following the defeat of the Corsican forces at the Battle of Ponte Novo, he was forced into exile. He went to Britain, became quite a celebrated figure there. But he returned after the French Revolution, and he helped create the Anglo-Corsican kingdom, and that lasted up until 1796. And then the island was reoccupied by France again, and he went into exile again, and he died in 1807. But he was a very significant factor in the development of Corsica. And Paoli, in fact, is all over the world. There are towns named after him. There's a Paoli in Pennsylvania, in Indiana, in Wisconsin, in Oklahoma, Colorado. So he's quite a significant figure. Now, after the collapse of France to the German Wehrmacht in the Second World War in 1940, it came under the rule of the Vichy French regime. They were collaborating with the Nazis. Prior to its use as an aircraft base to attack German-occupied Italy, it was liberated by Italian and Free French forces shortly after the Italian armistice in 1943. But later in the war, the island was nicknamed USS Corsica because the US military established 17 airfields on the island for tactical bombing groups attacking the targets in Italy. Now, in recent decades, Corsican nationalism has reared its ugly head. It's been a feature of the island's politics. They call for greater autonomy and protection for the Corsican culture and the Corsican language. Sadly, they've resorted to violence, mostly bombing of non-Corsican residents' holiday houses. In Propriano, when we were here, there was a new supermarket built on the hill above the town called Lyon, and they obviously didn't pay their dues to the nationalist movement because it was firebombed, it was rebuilt, it was firebombed again, it was rebuilt, it was firebombed again, and as far as I know, that was the last that they heard of it because they decided, okay, enough's enough, we're not going to stand for this, so they never rebuilt it. So the history of modern Corsica is really dominated by the struggles of these radical nationalists to achieve it's inside their own movement. It's riven by disagreement, splinter groups, private vendettas. Mafia groups certainly partially appropriated it as a cover to benefit from the huge amount of money that is poured into Corsica by the French government, but particularly by the European Union. Massive amounts. Corsica is the most heavily subsidized area of the whole of Europe, but a fair bit doesn't get spent on the purposes for which it was intended. I better not say any more. Corsican economy, least economically developed region in metropolitan France. Tourism is hugely important to the Corsican economy. The climate, the mountains, the coastlines make it very popular here as a tourist destination. It's not had the same level of intensive development as other parts of the Mediterranean, and therefore it is largely unspoilt. Its main exports are granite and marble, tannic acid, cork, cheese, citrus fruits, and olive oil. A little Propriano, well, its history, of course, is deeply entwined with the turbulent history of Corsica, which I've outlined. The inhabitants are mostly of Greek, Pisan, and Turkish origin. They go back several centuries. Like many Corsican towns, it's frequently invaded. I've told you of the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Saracens. Everybody came and invaded it over a period of time. The excavated ruins of two churches, the oldest dating from the 6th or 7th century, give us some evidence that Christianization of Corsica was quite advanced here in Propriano. On the site of the smaller church ruins, there's a necropolis from the 4th century that was discovered, but neither have been excavated in any meaningful way, so there's no big museum to show this. A man called Sampriero Corso, he landed here in 1564, and his job was to liberate Corsica from the Genoese, but these pirates, I'm afraid, had the upper hand, and many of the houses that were built were just simply ruined by them, and it took a long time for the town to be rebuilt. Corsica's got a very lively culture, numerous customs and traditions that go back in folklore, some cases dating back for centuries. Every year, about 300 villages separate their respective patron saints here. Now, this is an aerial view of the port, and I haven't had a chance to talk to the navigation officer, but there are some quite large ferries and ships in this port, so I would imagine that we're going to be moored here in the main port. This little area here is more of a sort of marina for pleasure boats, but I would imagine we're going to be right downtown in the port. And in my future talks, I'll be talking to the navigation officer to find out exactly where we're going to be moored, but he's been a bit busy today, so I haven't had a chance to do him like that. This is the center of the town. Here's the main port, and believe it or not, B here shows you where the tourist office is. So as you disembark, you'll be able to walk along the front here, and there's the tourist office where you can pick up town maps and information and literature. No great sites here, as I've said. The one church of any significance is Our Lady of Mercy. It's the only church of consequence in the town. It wasn't built and started until 1864, finished in 1881. It's newly renovated, and it really dominates the village and the Gulf of Valenco. Some pleasant little walks along the front of the harbour here, especially around the marina. Pleasant seafront walks, wander around the port, see if any of the mega yachts are in town. On the subject of mega yachts, just have a look at the biggest of them all. Now, we've seen some pretty big ones today in Monte Carlo. She wasn't, I don't think, there. It's the world's largest private yacht. Built by the German firm Lorsen, it's 590 feet long, 400 million pounds, about $600 million cost, and it's knocked Roman Abramovich's yacht off the top spot. Sojourn is 650 feet long. This is 590 feet long, so it's not much smaller than this boat, and this is for one owner to enjoy and have his guests on board. His name is Khalifa Al Nahyan, and he's president of the United Arab Emirates, and it was only delivered to him last year, 2013. It can travel in excess of 30 knots. Sojourn's top speed, 19 knots. Power comes from a combination of 2 gas turbine engines and 2 diesel engines. My son works for a small company that's found itself a very nice little niche in the marketplace. He's always been involved with IT, but he now works for a small company that specializes in servicing and renovating and keeping in good order the IT systems, the navigation systems, and the entertainment systems on billionaires' yachts. And this is exactly what he does. Now, he's very discreet, so I can't, I'm afraid, tell you any inside information about who the rest of these things are. But the next 4 biggest, just to quickly go through them, The Eclipse was the biggest. This is Roman Ivanovich's monster. It's 536 feet long. They reckon that the cost could have approached, they think, 800 million euros. So it's just an extraordinary. Dubai up there, that's the name of the yacht currently owned by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, and he's the ruler of the Emirates of Dubai. Al Saeed down here is owned by the Sultan Qaboos of Oman, and this one down here is one of the yachts owned by the Saudi royal family, Abdullah ibn Abdulaziz Al Aziz. So let's move on to what is actually one of my favorite subjects, the local food and drink in Propriano. The Corsicans are basically mountain dwellers rather than sea dwellers, and their food tends to be meat rather than fish, which is unusual for the Mediterranean. It's renowned for its charcuterie. You must try the smoked sausages and the hams, especially those made from the wild boar. Other traditional foods include Corsican soup and beans, small brown trout from the mountain rivers, game including wild boar, lamb, veal, seafood, etc. Wine is produced in the island, not bad, some of it. Some of it's pretty acidic, but the best ones are from Patrimonio, Capcorse and Sartenay. They're in the southwest. Red's often reasonable. Rosé is excellent. The Rosé Gris, which is a delicate pale pink rosé, is particularly refreshing. Some good white wines. Most famous of all, perhaps, is the Corsican Muscat, which is a dessert drink everywhere as an aperitif. So there's a lot of interesting local foods here. The most emblematic cheese is pronounced broach, spelled brocchiu, and that's a bit similar to ricotta. It's used in cheesecakes and chestnut flour donuts. The soft, creamy sheep's cheeses are often famous here. Chèvre, the goat's cheeses, good news. And I wonder if perhaps I can just impart a little information. I had an Aunt Ella who was married to a diplomat, and she told me once how to tell when a soft cheese is perfect and ready for eating. And I might just impart this to you, so if you learn nothing else tonight, you'll know how to do it. A brie or a camembert or any soft cheese. She was told this apparently by the Baroness de Rothschild.